Hey guys, so the New Jeans fandom is crumbling. Everyone's racing to the exits like it was a crashing NFT in 2022. And the poster child for this about face from the fans, the diehard fans even, has been Hanni. In some extents, Hanni, Minji, and Danielle, but it's easier to settle upon Hanni because I believe of her individual actions, yes. I think she should be held to account for her individual bullying actions, and then being the front woman to go to the National Assembly with that audacious bullying claim that has been proven to be false. She should be held accountable for that. However, where sometimes I feel like it's easy when there's people just trying to pile for the exits, and not everybody, but some people might be saying like, oh, like because she's Vietnamese, like it makes it easier in some people's minds to separate, oh, well, yeah, like, I knew better, or like, oh yeah, she's like different. You know, a lot of this fandom craziness is psychological, and how much of the idol becomes a substitute for you, and making that disconnect, cutting the umbilical cord to the idol, is a traumatic experience. One that sometimes, if you work this way in your mind, is made easier by blaming somebody's race or culture. And I do not think that that should happen at all. And there are some people in Korea, like on the far right, who are saying like, oh, well, you know, she's like a communist, a Vietnamese. Now that is actually really ignorant in the sense, especially for a Korean person to say, because it's the equivalent of mistaking a South Korean for a North Korean and not even knowing that you're doing it. But at the same time, it made me realize how ignorant I am about Vietnam and its history, and especially beyond, you know, the Vietnam War or even the French colonial occupation, about how much of a gap there was in my understanding. So I want to take you on a little trip to get to know Vietnam and answer, do Vietnamese people really, really hate New Jeans Hanni for real? So there are claims online saying that Vietnamese people do not like Hanni, and especially her family, because they see Hanni's family as traitors to Vietnam. Now, I'll tell you why that is false and why that is somewhat true. The reason why it is somewhat true is that most of the people who fled Vietnam were on the losing side of the Vietnam War. It was very similar to Korea and the Korean War. North communist, South capitalist, essentially North and South fighting. And the reason why I think maybe Korea is a little bit easier to understand is that we still have North, and if you're on the northern side or you wanted to stay on the northern side, you get your North Korea and you get your North Korean identity. And if you want, and if you were on the South Korean side, you still get your South Korean identity. You still have a motherland. Not so in Vietnam. The North won the entire war, so the entire country, for lack of a better term, essentially turned into North Vietnam. Of course, South Vietnam is still there, but the North won the entire country, whereas in Korea, you have a North and South, and you can easily think, oh, those are the North people, those are the South people. Well, the South people, not all of them, but a significant proportion of the population in South Vietnam, had to flee and leave because they were not on the side of North Vietnam. Now, the reason why you can somewhat argue that, yes, North or Vietnamese people consider Hanni's family traitors or whatnot, is that essentially they're supposed to say that if you're going to be a hard line, old school Vietnamese who wants to make sure they're not going to get in trouble with the communist government, you label everybody who was living in South Vietnam during that time, and especially if they fled abroad, you just kind of blanket say everybody. And apparently the majority of the Vietnamese people you see around you are from South Vietnam and had to immigrate under duress, because you're either gonna be eliminated by the new government because you are closely aligned with the South Vietnamese government and infrastructure, and we'll go into the more economic part, or immediately after the war, the South Vietnamese were very much discriminated against and targeted under a lot of anti-communist programs and had to suffer a lot, so they left as well. So in general, anybody who left, Vietnamese people, if you're going to be like totally hardline old school, you're supposed to say, oh yes, they're all traitors. That's why we had to go to war and that's why we won. But apparently, in the modern Vietnam, it's not like that. But in that sense, yes. But there hasn't been any evidence presented about exactly Hanni's family, like how close they were aligned. And, in some ways, it's not our business. That is the place where, if you want to compare it to Korea, there are people who are criticized in Korea of having a pro-Japanese family history. So especially during colonial occupation, where Japan was colonizing Korea, there's always co-conspirators, fellow Korean people who are going to be on the side of Japan to get rewards, get better positions, get better businesses, basically money and power and security of being aligned with your oppressor. And so that has somewhat carried through even to the modern day. And so if your family was like really documented, and they even have like the names in a museum somewhere in Korea, you can see the names that were documented as being literally like not peons, like what do you call it? Like tools of the colonial Japanese government. So in the sense, in Vietnam, there was definitely families like that who were Vietnamese, and more particularly in the South, that were collaborating with the colonial infrastructure, namely France, but then became the US, France, and being seen as corrupt and selling out their own people and continuing a system where the country itself gets impoverished, but the spoils of the resources and labor go back to France and to that collaboration class of Vietnamese. And in that case, like, if it could be documented that somebody's family was from there, then maybe you can have like a very strong, legitimate claim, like, yes, they are, they were traitors to Vietnam. But from what we've seen right now, it's just more of a speculation and more of trying to kind of shoot at a bigger target to see maybe, like, yes, in general, everybody who fled, there could be a chance that their family, like, on what scale of collaboration were they? Like, real in with, Paris or even Washington, D.C. later? Or was it just like they were living in South Vietnam and then they got tired of being harassed, under these like anti-communist things, and like being accused of being anti-communist because maybe like your rose garden was too anti-communist for your neighbor and she wanted to rat you out because she held a grudge against your flowers. So you don't know on what scale that is. But that is part of the history. That's part of the history. And the fact that, I really didn't even know the majority of the people, and they say like, essentially like all the people who are the diaspora of the Vietnamese around the world who had to, flee, majority of them were from South Vietnam. It could be the fact that they may have heritage in the North, but they moved down to South Vietnam before the war broke out, and then they were kind of lumped into like being South Vietnamese enemies, and so they had to flee for their life or opportunities. And again, with the whole Asian diaspora, especially like in America, they don't really talk too much about the prior history because it's traumatic. They're trying to assimilate, even being forced to assimilate into the new country. And some might not even really know their history that much. And of course, I'm new to this, so if you're Vietnamese, please feel free to correct things in the comments. But that's the thing, you know, like how I've complained before about like, you know, I'm really sort of pissed off at my Indian friends because they didn't really teach me much about Indian food. They kind of kept that to themselves. And, you know, it's like the equivalent, you know, like somebody goes to a Chinese restaurant, they're ordering the lemon chicken. Okay. That's sort of like the way that I was like ordering Indian food like an idiot. And then, you know, even with Vietnamese, the basic thing you should know is like the history of like at least the most recent event that created this immigration, North versus South, and that the majority of the people are going to be from South Vietnam. Why? Because of their connection to the South, which was aligned with the United States. Because we really have to understand Vietnam, because there is only so much you can claim about being connected to Vietnamese culture by talking about pho or nails or giving, you know, the secret in to which donut shops have Vietnamese sandwiches. And part of the confusing part is that a lot of times, especially if you're in America, you're looking at Vietnam through the lens of the Vietnam War and the stories of the veterans or battles. Now, that is very legitimate. That's very traumatic, and honor should be given to them, but it does not help us understand. And how many people do you know are still like, I don't understand the Vietnam War. Why were we in Vietnam? I don't understand. And in a way, it's almost like trying to understand Star Wars if you only looked at like Han Solo's storyline, like a mercenary fighter, and you just don't, you know, get the overall picture. What is, you know, essentially the battle for good and evil with like Darth Vader and then Luke Skywalker and all that kind of stuff. But you're just looking at, you know, Harrison Ford running around space like going yeehaw. And yes, I don't think your Vietnamese friends, a lot of us friends, when they're more like acquaintances or people we know, are not really going to go all into this with you. And, you know, Korean people, they think that, you know, they're similar. Like they're not going to go into all of this drama, and they think that they're very like, you know, keep their personal lives close to the vest, but you get one drop of soju in them and it's just spilling out all over the place. And there's somebody in the back writing all it down to put it into a Netflix series script. And so we know a lot of Korea, but I don't think we know that much about Vietnam. And with increasing ties economically, culturally between Vietnam and Korea, I think it's very important for us to respect Vietnam and give a little bit of love on Vietnam today. So the way I want to tell this story today is not through the lens of the American GIs in the Vietnam War or even French colonials going to Vietnam, but through the last names of the people who you probably know who are Vietnamese, and, you know, you're scared to pronounce their names. I think that's also a thing. Like, it's just like, I can't even pronounce your last name right. How am I going to ask you about the history? Please do not ask me to say your name. And I think that's maybe part of the reason, but let's go straight into it because we want to know. And it's very interesting, like how the last names kind of frame the history. So the most popular name is, and I can't pronounce it well, but it's Nguyen, Nguyen. I thought it was the same as Win, Huynh, because that's win. And then Nguyen has like an NG sound in the beginning. But why is that the most popular name? It's because it was the last name of the last dynasty that ruled Vietnam until French occupation. And then during French occupation or in colonialism, they kept on the Nguyen emperors as puppet heads, and then even brought them back during World War II when the Japanese, for like that brief 4 or 5 year period, colonized Vietnam and set up a puppet emperor, bringing back the Nguyen, last Nguyen emperor. If you're wondering, Hanni's last name, Pham, is the fourth most popular name, and that name is not associated with a ruling imperial dynasty, but they've been prominent in Vietnamese history as members of the military, scholarly, and bureaucratic elite. So, they're sort of like, the fancy lawyer class that was very prominent in Vietnam. Now, of course, all of these names doesn't mean like, if you have this name, it definitely means you're, that type of person. During war and stuff, people all changing their names all over the place, and you never know because, it's, before blockchain verifiable documentation. So the Nguyen Dynasty, Nguyen, ruled from 1802 to 1945 officially, but it was more of like 1802 to the late 19th century. Now this reads like a K-drama, okay? Because it also weaves in, well, where did the French people come in? So we got to back it up a little bit. Before 1802, there was a different, very short rulership, about 30 years, if that, where there was an overthrow of, the elites by a peasant rebellion because they've been starving to death and they've been so oppressed. So it started in 1771 peasant uprising called the Tay Son Rebellion, and it was against the corrupt landlords, the tax officials in Vietnam. And then by 1778, the leaders of this rebellion, which was a bunch of three brothers, they declared that they're going to be the emperors of Vietnam, and they were. They were for a little while until 1802, right? So then that's like not even 30 years. And it's because like after the main brothers passed away, the third brother was sort of more just like kind of there, like I guess a talented, more bureaucrat. So when the two brothers died, each took a turn as the emperor, and then the son of one of the emperors took the mantle, but messed it up. Couldn't hold it. Why? Because just like out of a K-drama or like Game of Thrones or something like that, you know how they overthrew the elite ruling class to take over Vietnam? Well, this is a little bit complicated too, because during that time, Vietnam was ruled essentially by two factions. Again, North versus South. The South was ruled by the Nguyen, and then the North was ruled by Trinh. So you might know people with the last name Trinh. Okay, they were ruling the North, Trinh. But they weren't really on paper ruling, because still on paper there was a king, sort of like the royal family in England being like a figurehead. There, by this time, that royal family in Vietnam just weak, and they were just there in name only, the Le, L-E. And so it was really run by, the Trins in the north and the Nguyen's in the south. And then this rebellion in 1771 that solidified in 1778, that overthrew the Trin and the Nguyen's for a while. Well, what had happened is that they overthrew the Nguyen's, right? They killed all of them except one got away. One son, like he was, the lost Anastasia, if she was really Anastasia from, the Romanov family. Or it was like Siddhartha going on a permanent gap year. It wasn't just like, oh, look at the suffering of the normal people. It's just like, no, you're suffering too now. And so, he was out for revenge. This is a revenge story. So the last Nguyen prince wanted to get his kingdom back, okay? Wanted it, for better or worse. He could have been, his family definitely was overthrown because they were accused of being corrupt and taking advantage of all the peasants. But still, Prince got them prince preferences, and they want their kingdom back. And so how are you going to do it without a real army? How are you going to do it without any money? No power? Well, you know how the Europeans are now like circling around Asia like they're flies at a picnic? Well, he met up with the French, okay? So he made an alliance during this time, like 1780s and 1790s, what this Prince Nguyen did was make alliances with the French, particularly through this Bishop Pignon de Behin. And then he obtained French military aid, advisors, and weapons. And then he also brought in some help from Chinese merchants and Cambodian elites. So very strategic by getting the people who are on the other side of the coin in all these other dramas from, in a different country. Let's all work together. So then over 2 decades, he rebuilt his power base and he slowly reconquered the territory from the Tay Son peasant rebellion. And he unified the country in 1802, and he set up his empire under the name Jia Long. I was like, Jia Long? Did he get like a Hollywood name? No, it means it's a symbol saying like unification of North and South. Jia Din South, Tang Long North. So Jia Long means a combination of North and South. And he moved the capital to the middle of the country, Hue, and that was the capital of Vietnam for 143 years. 143 years took it to 1945, but then where did French colonialism happen? Oh, yes, this isn't the case. Your allies backstabbed you, right? Because he got help from the French. How'd the French suddenly take over his country? Because in the 1830s and 1850s, that's when France was getting really sus, coveting thy neighbor's things. And what had happened was that Jia Long, the prince that got retribution, got his empire back, his country back. He died in 1820, and then his son took over. And you know what happens, once sons kind of take over, it gets a little bit weaker. However, we can't blame the son too much because it looked like this royal family, because of all the treachery that they've been through, knew what was up. So even though they had that help from the French to recapture their empire and continue to have relations with the French, they were very careful with not having France come in and run amok. They really did impose this anti-Catholic, anti-missionary activity, and they saw that this was a threat to, their power and then their cultural order. However, that persecution, so it turns into persecution a bit towards missionaries or people who were there under the guise, okay, you have to say some of them, yes, were there for religious reasons. Otherwise, other people were hiding, their JIT under Jesus. And so they antagonized and gave it what it seems like from the French perspective, an excuse for France to be like, look, you guys have hurt us. We need to retaliate. So this went back and forth, and France officially attacked in 1847, the first signs of military conflict at Danang. Now it's like the new Bali with all of the resorts. Yeah, that's where you're going. You're going to the place where Vietnam started to get attacked by the French. Now, why would the French, of course, they say it's about like, oh yeah, you're persecuting us. Oh, come on. Well, if it was persecuting, why was the first priority the abundant natural resources? So southern Vietnam was really attractive to, of course, the Vietnamese and also people who wanted to colonize for resources because it has access to the Mekong River, so that potentially can control a trade port to China, Laos, Cambodia. It has rice, timber, rubber. And back in the day, right, like before industrialization, it was more about natural resources as really the source of wealth and power, kind of like how now digital data is in our world. And so people really coveted areas that were abundant in these types of natural resources. And remember, rubber, okay, like you don't have the Michelin restaurant without Michelin the tire company. Michelin the tire company from France don't have their tire company without the rubber that came from Vietnam and Indochina. So the other, like Thailand, Cambodia, Indonesia, that region of providing these natural resources. And now you can, debate over like Hell's Kitchen about like 1, 2, 3 stars for the Michelin ranking. Now the French say like, you know what? We shouldn't be treated this way. We helped you win this country back. So, it looks like they wanted a quid pro quo, but they're constantly being rebuffed because, these emperors just got back their empire and they know how sus everybody is, even the people that helped you. You got to be even more careful about that sussiness. And so in 1858, the actual French invasion began. And again, at Danang. I wonder, which resort has the place where it was the actual dock with all those soldiers coming in. And in only 4 years, Vietnam had to sign this Treaty of Saigon, because France did well and, fighting against the Nguyen Dynasty. So southern Vietnam, including Saigon, was ceded or given to France. And so this was the first formal colonized region. Did they stop there? No. France wanted more. So 1883 to 1885, so about 20 years later, they're like, let's go get some more. And then so they got control over the central and northern areas of Vietnam. And then they just said like, well, okay, let's kit and caboodle this whole thing. The Treaty of Hue in 1883 formalized France's protectorate over the entire country. So protectorate is just one step away from now this is our country. And then in 1887, France did more than that. They did the most. They combined Vietnam with other countries that they conquered: Vietnam, Laos, Cambodia, and they established the Union of French Indochina. So that was, like a set, okay? They got their whole Southeast Asia set and called it Indochina. So where did the Nguyen Dynasty go now? Well, they kept them there. They said like, okay, you're going to stay in Hue and you're only going to have symbolic power. You'll just do the shows, but you'll have no power. The French will be calling the shots, and then Vietnam's entire economy, because if it was really about missionary work, then wouldn't they be just, focusing on like setting up churches and pews and stained glass and stuff like that? No, they restructured the Vietnamese economy to benefit the French capitalists. Rice, rubber, coal, even opium were major exports controlled by French firms and landowners. Vast tracts of land were given to French settlers and collaborators. Now, collaborators, that's the key, is your own Vietnamese people who are going to be, all up in the francophone and be like, yeah, we'll help. And the Vietnamese were subjected to forced labor, essentially being slaves in their own country. And this, I think, is the most maddening part of all, because France took over, right? Then French citizens had more rights than Vietnamese. In between French citizens was Eurasians, like if you're mixed. And so the only hope to really kind of rise in this society, if you were Vietnamese, if you would be educated and basically be a collaborator, and then you would be called an évolué. I think that means like you're evolved, okay? Like more insult to Vietnam. French education, French language schools, that was where the elite would go. Similar to in Korea during the Japanese colonization, the elite would go to even Japan to study. Now, during this time, 1890s to early 1900s, there were revolts and movements. And then by 1920s, 30s, more movements. So it's not as if, they were taking this lying down. And this is the start of, the North Vietnamese power base, because in that time period, 1920s and 30s, that's when the Indochinese Communist Party, founded by Ho Chi Minh in 1930, started to take off. So this is now the other power play is that like, look, this is now like a weird hybrid French thing. I don't know if I need to like dip my baguette into my pho. What is going on? And so you had people who want to take over their country back. And during this time, a lot of the movements where people wanted to take back their country from the colonialists were associated with the communists. And again, that ideology, the speech of that is like, look, commune, this is ours. We need to share in this country together, not just this tiny elite of Vietnamese. We're collaborating with all them, French people just run things. So I hate to say, but like, one of my favorite tea shops in Paris, the French tea, that came from this type of environment of people being colonialists back then and developing their, supply of tea, and then like, French flavor everything. They flavored it up to the max and it's delicious, but, comes from, this kind of a system where half the land in Vietnam that you can farm in southern Vietnam was under French or French aligned control. And this is the part where people say like, oh, you're a traitor, you're a collaborator. And whenever you see things like aligned or interest, that means like on paper, it might be a Vietnamese owner, but really it is going to be the French person, French power behind the scenes controlling things.
In Hue, capital of the Annan section of Indochina, the Japanese, always so polite, do not disturb the semblance of ancient rule, likewise carefully preserved by the French colonial administration. In a modern home built for her by the French at Dalat, the Empress of Annan brings up her 3 attractive children in truly royal atmosphere. She accepts with oriental resignation the obvious facts of the situation.
But what happened after World War II? Well, of course, France wanted to get back in there and just bring things back to how it was. But there was now a bit of a communist problem with Ho Chi Minh gaining power in the north.
Des rapports peuvent se rétablir tels que la France continue à jouer une sorte de rôle culturel ici.
Avec la France surtout et avec tous les autres pays. Nous voulons avoir une coopération amicale, culturelle, économique, etc. Mais je suis sûr que vous ne voulez pas avoir, n'est-ce pas, que la France ait l'influence qu'elle avait avant. C'est une autre chose.
Naturellement, c'est une autre époque.
Mais coopération culturelle.
And so now, again, it's like re-sparking this north and south, the regional conflict. The power base of Ho Chi Minh is, and the communists are in the north, and then the south, that was the southern Vietnamese and France trying to retake the colony from 1946 to 1954. However, in 1954, that's when the North Vietnamese decisively defeated French forces and France basically gave up. There was the Geneva Accords in July 1954. And so Vietnam was temporarily divided at the 17th parallel. The north is the communists under Ho Chi Minh. The south is the state of Vietnam under Bao Dai. So they brought, he just came from central casting all the time whenever they just needed a figurehead, but he was soon replaced by the first Vietnamese, the South Vietnamese president that was essentially like approved and kind of regime changed by the United States. Elections to reunify the country were supposed to happen in 1956, but it never happened because, who wants to be on the losing side? We had a truce in 1954. All right, in 2 years, essentially, you basically have to guarantee that it's going to be somebody from the north or somebody from the south that's going to be the president. And then what are we going to do? One side is going to have to lose, and they didn't want that. So it never happened. They kept the division. There was a rigged election in the south, and so Diem won 98.2% of the vote, and he was chosen because he was a strong anti-communist nationalist. He also had a history of opposing French colonial rule. So it was like the best of both worlds. It's hard to find somebody who's anti-communist who was also anti-French. And so in his resume, at least, he was like, against both of them, here for Vietnam. And that, of course, would lend well to getting the trust of the Vietnamese electorate. And it also allowed the U.S. to say, like, oh, no, we're not putting in a puppet there, even though it looked like it really was. And then he was also a devout Catholic. And so that really aligned with the U.S. power brokers who were involved in this situation. And there was really no better alternative, historians say. But it backfired, of course, because Diem was just corrupt. He was authoritarian. He ruled through nepotism, and he also showed contempt for rural peasants. So creating a lot of enemies. And in 1963, so, he had a good run, maybe about like 8 years. There was a military coup and he was knocked out. Yes. And it apparently the U.S. saw him as a liability and said, like, well, if it were to happen, we wouldn't mind. And he was taken out just 20 days before JFK was taken out. The 60s was a big time for, people getting taken out. And so during this time, you're thinking like, okay, right, this is when like the U.S. really got into Vietnam, right? Because they're thinking like, oh gosh, during this, after the war, World War II, and this time, all this French stuff, like, started to, it seems like it's like now changing hands to American companies that are profiting off of South Vietnam. And it looks like the United States did not want another Cuba. In the Cuba situation, there was all this investment. Like it was basically the Las Vegas of like the Caribbean. And, a lot of money laundering went in there, a lot of real estate investment. And then once Castro was like, nope, done, canceled, you lost your deposit, you lost all your investment into Cuba and all your factories and all that kind of stuff. And so they don't want another, similar thing in Vietnam. Who wants to give up, cash cows like this? And so the U.S. starts to earnestly invade in 1965. So 1965 to 1975, horrible destruction and war. So of course we've, heard about like a lot of the protests against the Vietnam War in the United States. Well, that started to have an effect. And so 1973 was the beginning of the U.S. withdrawal and the Paris Peace Accords, where there was a ceasefire, the U.S. military withdrawal, prisoner exchanges, and then this promise for a peaceful political resolution between North and South. But apparently, in reality, the war really didn't stop completely. It was just now entering its final phase without real American military presence. And so the South Vietnamese were supposed to fight on their own, but they had become, way too dependent on the U.S. So without U.S. troops and their aid, they essentially started to collapse. And then in 1975, 2 years later, the North Vietnamese can sense, blood in the water, and they went full force into the South, and they took over the capital of South Vietnam, and thereby they win. And so that's when you get the Miss Saigon moment, right? Like people trying to leave the embassy off of the helicopter. Yes, they were, I guess, non-Vietnamese people, but the Vietnamese people who really needed to leave were essentially the people who were in the South Vietnamese government or allied with it, or VIPs that would be the first to have their heads chopped off if there was like a political retribution by the North once things got settled. So they wanted to hightail it out of there. So even though it ended in 1975, there were people here, they're Vietnamese. They're living in South Vietnam. Yes, they may have been, associated with politics, economy, or just, living in the neighborhood in South Vietnam, but then they were targeted, especially between 1975 and 1979. This is when you have the boat people crisis saying like, I'm getting out of here. I'm getting out of here because the communist government launched re-education camps. You might you might have to go to like a concentration camp to be re-educated. They wanted to get that French stuff out of you. Your land might be confiscated. And there was even ethnic cleansing of specific ethnic Chinese, Vietnamese people. And so a lot of people just like, I'm leaving, even if I can't go through the air, I'm going through the water. And then you have like a lot of the stories that we've heard about, like, when people are saying like, yeah, my parents, my family, they escaped Vietnam, like they were one of the boat people. Like, so this is essentially the environment they were under. If you're looking at like from from the Northern Vietnamese perspective, like if you're talking about the discrimination against the South Vietnamese, some of the most common prejudices to justify this tension and situation was they said Southerners are less ideological or patriotic. They're too corrupted by capitalism, by Western influences, moral decay, maybe too many baguettes. And so Northerners thought that the Southerners were just less disciplined, also materialistic, corrupt. And so after 1975, many in the North believed that the Southern people prioritized money and appearances over ideology, that they lacked real revolutionary virtue. And so this is why it's a little bit ironic for when there was that statement, remember, from that interview that Nugent gave saying like, oh, we're real revolutionaries in K-pop. Well, you can definitely say that without any historical context, but I mean, essentially like a revolution has a historical context unless you really claim in what you're doing right now is revolutionary. And so it doesn't match. She wouldn't be a revolutionary. Hanni's family wouldn't be a revolutionary. There would be actually the anti-revolutionaries, against the communists. And also, by that token, it is really ignorant for when Korean people want to criticize Hanni for her Vietnamese heritage as being a communist. That's really ignorant because she is part of the group that fled the communists. So they're like the real like anti-communists. And, they even say like, I was like, okay, so like this is so unfortunate. You really have to wrap your head around this. Like they lost, right? But most of the time, not all of the time, but there is a country that you can have for the losing group. Like even in China against the Maoists or the communists versus the Kuomintang, they fled to Taiwan. And so they're in Taiwan. And then, North Korea and South Korea, it just, you're in North Korea or you're in South Korea. Even the Civil War in the United States, the Southerners, the Confederates, they did not have to flee to other countries. You're not seeing like Southern peach cobbler pop up in like Djibouti or, in Indonesia where people have fled. They got to stay in the South. But I was just like, well, where is there a country or is there a place, a homeland, a new separate homeland for the South Vietnamese? Apparently, some people say it's in Westminster, California. Okay. Like, if you're thinking like, you have a little Saigon in your city, well, Westminster apparently is like the new South Vietnam in California. So Hanni's family was among the group that had to flee South Vietnam, and a lot of the Vietnamese also went to Australia. And so a lot of people saying like, she had nothing to do with this whole situation in South Vietnam, don't blame her for it. Other people saying like, oh, well, looks like she has like collaborator roots and, that's why it looks like she's just so good at betraying. I would say at this point, leave her Vietnamese heritage out of it and just judge her on her individual actions. Whether that was, a product of parenting that had a legacy in, alleged co-conspiratorishness, well, whatever. That can be its own thing, and that they can talk about that in the Pham household. But for our intents and purposes, I think we should really look at her individual actions and not bring her Vietnamese heritage into it. But because people brought the Vietnamese heritage into it, I was so curious to cure my ignorance about Vietnam. And so I wanted to go on this deep dive and take you along with me. And again, This was just like my first real deep dive into this pool of Vietnam and its history. So please add your comments, put your reflections, and put what you think down below. Remember to like, share, and subscribe, and we'll see you again next time. Bye-bye.